Welcome back. I'm Jim LaPierre. This is Sober Now, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a Q&A. Folks are very welcome and encouraged to write in on any of the streams that we have going today. I will try to get to everybody, but if I don't, I promise I'll get to you in a follow-up. Let's see. If you haven't been over to Sober Now's Facebook page, please get over there and give it a quick like. You'll get notified about future live streams and other content that we're creating. So let's get into it. I was very pleased. Thank you to those who sent private messages and Facebook posts about your questions. Most everything that was asked of me today relates to anxiety, which is not really surprising. Anxiety was at an all-time high in our culture prior to the start of the pandemic. And so nowadays it's incredibly common. A lot of folks are struggling, most notably our young people. So if you have kiddos or adolescents in your life, please just be aware there's a better than average chance that they're really struggling with feelings of anxiety and potentially with their mental health. So just something to be aware of and be checking in on. Let's just dive into a few of the questions that were posed. Thank you again to those who wrote in. And first question, when something is anxiety producing but we have no control over it, what are the best ways to cope? Well, having no control means powerlessness. And in my experience, this is probably one of the most difficult lessons to learn. My experience is that it's spiritual in nature, and it's one of the hardest but most rewarding lessons that we can learn. Perspective really is everything, and I need to have a mindset where managing anxiety means being able to keep a healthy mindset and get it back when I lose it. So I can ask myself, what is it that I'm focusing on? Do I have control over this? What can I reasonably do about this? My big motivation behind accepting powerlessness is realizing that the only thing I hate more than being powerless is all the crazy shit that I do when I don't accept that I'm powerless. I go spending time and energy on things that I can't control because what I'm really trying to do is have some way to manipulate the situation or some way to have influence over this because I don't want to be powerless. And particularly for affected others, for those of us who have children, even when our adult children struggle, we find our lives and our perspective overshadowed by the struggles of people that we love. And so this is an especially painful and difficult thing to adjust to. But there's many times where you just find yourself tied up in knots or feeling anxious and you're not even sure what's happening, what's going on with you. So the three questions that I have found to be most helpful to pose to myself when I find myself in such a state is, first of all, how am I doing? And the hard part is I have to be really honest, because what I want to say is that everything's fine, everything's good, but to really take stock, to be introspective, to ask yourself, what is it that is weighing on me? What is it that I am finding painful right now? Rigorous honesty with self is a tough thing to do, but it is absolutely necessary, and I remind folks quite often that I have yet to find anything in this world worth lying to myself about. The second question, as silly as it may sound, is I ask myself, what am I doing? And here again, I have to be brutally honest. I'm focused on something that I'm powerless over. I'm worrying. I'm putting a lot of nervous energy into something that I can't do anything about. But if I can identify the unhealthy things that I'm doing, I can practice this really great recovery strategy, which is to simply take pause. Just stop. Take stock, cope, breathe, get back in the here and now, and then ask yourself, okay, this thing that I'm doing, this thing that I'm feeling, what is it that I need to do about that? And most often for me, the answer is I need to be able to share this with other people. I need to seek support. I need accountability. I need to bounce this off of someone that I trust and get their take on it. particularly when we're feeling overwhelmed. Being able to break things down into manageable pieces is absolutely vital to having a healthy mindset and to ensuring that we're responding and not reacting to whatever the situation is. When we don't have a perspective that factors in powerlessness, too often we end up feeling hopeless or helpless. And of course, a healthy perspective allows me to see I am safe and well. I am concerned for others. Worry is unhealthy and taxing to me. To be concerned is healthy. And I can reasonably ask the person that I'm concerned about, what is it that I can do to help you? I can share what my concerns are, but I have to be willing to accept that they may or may not be ready to identify that something is a problem. They may or may not be willing to accept support, and that is simply the best that I can do. I can put myself out there, I can share my feelings, thoughts, and concern, but then I have to be willing to accept the boundaries that my loved one or other present. Too often our struggles, particularly with anxiety, are a product of avoidance. They're a product of withdrawing and going through things alone. And what I often say to folks is that fear is specific, but anxiety is general. When I'm afraid of something, if I choose to address it in a healthy way, then the chances are things are going to go well. If I am avoidant or less than honest with myself about what my fears are, if I am in denial of them, then what happens is we end up repressing the feelings that we have, and we end up kind of blocking out or ignoring the nature of our fear, which tends to fuel anxiety very high, very quickly. And whenever I'm again pushing something away or in denial of it, then what results is the feeling of anxiety and this nervous energy. But then when you try to locate in your mind, what is it that's stressful for me? What is it that I'm freaking out about? You can't really find the thing that you're repressing. You can't really find the thing that you're in denial about or avoiding. And so in a very practical way, that leaves you in a place where you are afraid and you're not sure why. And so what will most often happen is that your mind will subconsciously decide on something that's relatively superficial or something that you can fixate on. And these are the times where we find ourselves cleaning house obsessively or organizing in some undue, unnecessary way. And what we're really doing is trying to outlet this nervous energy in hopes that we'll feel better afterwards. My suggestion is write out what scares you, which is scary in and of itself because it makes it more real. Saying things out loud make them more real. Writing them down makes it more real. And the reason for that is that we're moving away from detachment, away from denial, and towards acknowledging what's real, what our needs are, and what it is that we need to do about this. Bringing it out into the open makes things more amenable to change. We can choose to share our fears. Asking for reassurance is huge. It's one of the healthiest things that we can do. Having people who will simply listen and validate us is a big step in the right direction. And I always urge folks, don't stay in fear alone. We've already done too much of that in our lives. I'd also, I'd also encourage folks to explore the relationship between stress and anxiety, because one feeds the other. And at other times, what we're referring to as stress is really a euphemism. There's no vulnerability in saying that we're stressed. It's socially expected that we should have stress, but too often what we're really doing is saying that we're depressed because it's less vulnerable than saying I'm sad. We say that we're stressed because it's less vulnerable than saying that we're anxious. This morning, someone near and dear to me took one look at me and immediately said, "Okay, you look stressed." And I responded with, "I've got a growing collection of first world problems." This is, to me, maintaining gratitude and maintaining a healthy perspective. I'm fond of saying that all of my problems are good problems, because the truth is, I am blessed beyond measure, but more importantly, the stress that's in my life is positive stress. I'm stressed because I have so many really cool things going on in my life and so many cool people to maintain connections with. And we don't really conceptualize positive stress, but that too needs an outlet. Notice the ways in which stress is manifesting in your body. Notice the routines and habits that you're ignoring that served you because you feel like you have too much going on or you're feeling overwhelmed. Quite often, people that see me regularly will ask me, "How are you doing?" And I'm actually very fond of saying life is good. And I do this for a lot of reasons, particularly when I'm working. I have bad days, just like everybody else, but I want to be coming from a place of gratitude, and I've learned to use this as a mantra because it is an affirmation. Life is sometimes very hard, and I certainly have gone through plenty of things that are painful. But at the end of the day, I have just an enormous amount to be grateful for. And so using that mantra has served me well. It has allowed me to be private when I'm working, and it is still a truthful statement as opposed to a denial of how I'm feeling. So the same person asked, other than mindfulness tools, what are some good ways to manage anxiety? And this may sound really counterintuitive, but what I will often encourage people to do is to ask themselves, if I wasn't feeling anxious, what would I be feeling? For a very high percentage of us, especially as survivors of trauma, find that there are particular emotions that we're uncomfortable feeling and uncomfortable expressing. And that's usually linked to the fear of loss of control. So anger is, for most of us, the hardest one. We feel like it's not safe to be angry. We feel uncomfortable expressing anger. And when we look through our history, we find that we only really got in touch with anger when we were overwhelmed or lost control, and then we lashed out. Too often, our struggles are really a product of the struggle for self-control. And what I remind folks of all the time is that you can have far greater self-control through self-acceptance than you could ever have by waging war with yourself or battling different parts of self. When you're managing anxiety, ask yourself, what is it that I'm avoiding? What am I conflicted about? Where is this manifesting in my body? Body work is absolutely huge, particularly for people who have chronic anxiety. We tend to have a lot of neuromuscular tension, especially in the neck and shoulders. We tend to have a lot of gastrointestinal problems, and a lot of us live with chronic pain conditions and even neurological conditions that are associated with particularly multi-layered trauma. Chronic anxiety, PTSD, results in lots of health concerns. And so caring for your body is not only a common sense approach to good health, it is also the foundation and the most important part of self-control. When we are feeling anxious, what most often happens is that our mind starts cycling very rapidly, our thoughts become circular. Meanwhile, our heart rate is increasing, our breathing is fast and shallow, and our muscle tension has increased. So in order to feel safe, in order to feel like we have a sense of self-control, your physical self is always where that starts. Revisit the tools that you're using for coping, and notice that there may be some opportunities to use them in a different way. The best example I have of that is that people very commonly use music to cope, but what they're doing is listening to something that's really mellow or listening to music that expresses how they want to feel as opposed to how they are feeling. So it's a bit counterintuitive, I suppose, but for a lot of us in different forms of recovery, listening to very angry music is actually soothing. It's listening to somebody else sing or scream or express the kind of emotion that I'm experiencing. And so Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name of, has always been my go-to. and just having that moment of expression and connecting to another person, even through music, about how it is that I'm feeling has been extremely helpful over the years. Next question, how do I deal with abandonment and PTSD from a young age? This honestly is something I could spend a week talking about because there's so much to unpack, and it's extremely common amongst people in recovery from substance use disorder. We find our way on a pathway to recovery from addiction only to discover that there are other pieces that desperately need our attention, and untreated trauma is probably the most common amongst them. Certainly, co-occurring mental illness, eating disorders, self-harm, all types of destructive things that people like me do to ourselves. All of these need our attention, but I'm fond of saying that people are rarely in one type of recovery. There's almost always at least another condition that needs our attention and our healing. The worst part of being a trauma survivor is perhaps the reliving of experiences and everything that we internalized from the experience. So those of us who have abandonment issues have a tendency actually to abandon ourselves. How do we do that? Countless ways, and almost all of them are unintentional, almost all of them are subconscious. One of the greatest benefits to mindfulness is being able to notice all of the thought patterns and all of the behaviors that occur on a subconscious level. And mindfulness allows us to just notice those, progressively make them conscious decisions. So the number one thing that we do without meaning to is dissociation, and this too can be thought of as a form of abandonment of self. It's meant to protect self from overwhelming emotion, from situations or circumstances that feel unsafe, but it is very much a disconnection from self. This is a great example of a survival skill, something that was once necessary and even adaptive for us. And throughout our childhood, that was true for many of us. As we become adults, as we leave dangerous situations and unhealthy environments, we find that we're still doing a lot of the things that we used to need to do to survive, and now those things are self-limiting or even damaging to self. And so we need to learn how to be grounded. We need to learn to be present in the here and now. We need to move away from avoidance and away from distraction, away from our tendency to focus on others, and be progressively connected to ourselves, because this fosters connection to others. If we conceptualize parts of self, then we can see opportunities to be more connected to our bodies, more connected and more accepting of our full range of emotion, not just the ones that we're comfortable with. We can notice that a fair amount of energy goes into blocking out certain thoughts, avoiding certain triggers, or trying not to remember aspects of our past. Most often that's our childhood. The net result of all this disconnection and avoidance too often is that our inner child becomes someone that we neglect, someone that we ignore, and tragically we end up unwittingly relating to ourselves in the very same ways that our abusers did. The next time you beat yourself up or find yourself feeling really self-critical, notice the things that you're saying to yourself in your self-talk, because I bet those are things that you picked up along the way. Those are things that we learned. So if we're going to focus on overcoming PTSD, which is an amazing and awesome goal and something that is widely needed, my first suggestion is always to check in with your primary care physician, because what we want to look for are ways in which chronic anxiety and specifically PTSD can be affecting your health. So again, chronic pain conditions, musculoskeletal tension, gastrointestinal problems are very, very common. All of those disturbances and more are associated with living with chronic anxiety. For some folks, exploring medication can be helpful. I'm neutral about it. I don't want to push you towards it or away from it. The difficulty is that there is no medication that is specifically designed to treat PTSD. So what you're looking at are a number of different options that one size does not fit all. It might work well for you, it might not. Something that addresses both anxiety and depression is likely to be helpful. This is something that we commonly find. You need to find a good med manager, which is hard. The average primary care physician only has a limited amount of training in education around psychotropic medication, and they typically have a very small comfort zone. So doctors, MDs, and physician assistants especially tend to be very comfortable prescribing SSRIs, Prozac, Paxil, and then medications that they see as relatively benign, meds like Wellbutrin or Zoloft. And quite often those meds are not helpful for folks who live with PTSD. So finding a psychiatric nurse practitioner, finding even a family nurse practitioner tends to be far better trained in mental health and psychotropics than MDs and PAs. Next up, find a really good trauma therapist, and that is no small task. Unfortunately, in my experience, a fair percentage of mental health therapists are ineffective or even unwilling to treat trauma. And the most common reason for this is that most of us are survivors of trauma. And the degree to which we have attended to our own wounds, the degree to which we have facilitated and gotten served for our own trauma really determines everything about how effective we are in facilitating healing and growth for others who have survived trauma. My best suggestion, always interview a therapist. Of course, the demand for therapy is greater than it's ever been in the history of the profession. So if you're even thinking about maybe counseling would be helpful to you, my suggestion is get on as many wait lists as you possibly can, because I don't know a competent professional that doesn't have a wait list right now. Interview them, talk about what it is that you feel you need, talk as specifically as you feel comfortable referencing the nature of your trauma. Ask what the clinician's experience is in treating it, ask what their comfort level is in treating it, and have a conversation about things like homework. Trauma recovery is so much more than sitting in somebody's office for 50 minutes a week. It is valuable, it has great potential, but what you do outside of sessions, moving outside of your comfort zone, developing more natural support, doing things differently in your life is ultimately what makes the greatest difference. The next step is we need kindred spirits along this journey. It's absolutely imperative. No one should be in any form of recovery alone. It is limiting, it is scary, it hurts, it's hard. So connecting with kindred spirits can be done in lots of different ways. 12-step fellowships are fantastic for those who are in recovery from substance use disorder and recovering from other conditions. But for those who don't find 12-step programs helpful, or maybe don't even have an addiction but are recovering from trauma, abuse, neglect, group therapy can be a great way to develop natural supports or even friendships. Different types of support groups can be really good for that as well. The next piece, examine in seeking to overcome trauma, we have to start to identify what are the ways in which trauma has undermined my sense of safety. Again, holistically, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. How does trauma continue to undermine my quality of life? How does it negatively affect the relationships that I have with others? this is really a vital difference between what we typically refer to as counseling and what we refer to as therapy. Counseling is really, ideally, should be about your life from today forward. Therapy is about how does your past continue to affect your present? How does it limit your present? How does it negatively affect or even harm you? And unfortunately, when it comes to trauma, we can't really say that the past is in the past because it continues to happen. So examining what is it that would help me to feel safer? What is it that, what are the barriers to developing support and healthier relationships? And what are the self-limiting things that I'm doing today, and how can those be changed? These are all excellent questions to bring to a trauma therapist and to learn from the experience of others, which is why fellowship is so vital. So, unfortunately, some of the saddest aspects of trauma is that we continue to relive it. We do this by experiencing flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and nightmares. But we also do it in recurring patterns in our lives. And too often what we're really doing is looking for a different ending to the same story. So in terms of romantic partnerships, and sometimes in terms of friendships and support systems, what we're doing is gravitating towards the familiar, cultivating relationships with people who are very similar to our family of origin, have the same defects or the same emotional unavailability or the same lack of support. And what we're hoping for is a transformative experience that allows us to stay in our comfort zone, get our needs met, and produce an outcome that none of our past attempts have. This, of course, is an impossibility. And we need to take note of the patterns in our lives so that we can gradually break free of them. One of the greatest challenges of surviving abandonment is that often we live in fear that it's going to happen again. It undermines our ability to trust. It becomes an expectation, and we are slow to let others be close to us. We test them, we hold them at arm's length, we look to see are they who they profess themselves to be, or are they going to reveal themselves to be a sick person, an unsafe person. Testing people never works. No matter how much we do it, we don't really feel safer or more comfortable. We just continue to test. Again, we approach all of these things without vulnerability. And so we make an accusation instead of asking for what it is that we need. The most common example is if a person fears abandonment, they look to their partner or to the people that they love most, and they push them away just to see if they come back. Or we make an accusation that I know you're going to leave me sooner or later, because what we want them to say is, oh no, I'm not going anywhere, I'm committed to this, I love you. And because we find it so terrifying to ask for what we need, we often unwittingly end up sabotaging relationships simply because it's too scary to talk about wants, needs, and feelings. The expectations are usually the last thing that we change, and this is something that I'm always encouraging people to examine, because surviving trauma, surviving past abuse, neglect, and unhealthy relationships, all of these things fuel our expectations, which is especially hard because expectations are subconsciously developed and subconsciously maintained. So I want to encourage folks to put this on paper. Take stock of every role that you fulfill in your life. Your role as a partner, a parent, an employee, a daughter, all of those roles. And what are the expectations of yourself? What are the expectations that others have of you? What are the standards that you hold yourself to? Do all of that, and notice when you're saying that, oh, I'm just hard on myself, or oh, I just have high standards, because my experience is that that's often minimizing what is actually self-abuse, what is actually the pursuit of perfectionism or some other unhealthy standard. Then write out what you expect of the people in your life and from people in general, because we learn to have rock bottom expectations as a way to avoid being disappointed by others. This also defines what our comfort zone allows for. So when folks surpass our expectations or want to give to us, even something as simple as a compliment, we're uncomfortable, and so we tend to deflect. We don't allow folks to have their own opinion, and we would do well just to smile and say thank you. Let other people have their own truth. Examine the ways in which trauma has left you closed-minded. Examine the ways in which fear has prevented you from connecting to others. Look for the ways in which guilt and shame have closed your heart and your mind to other experiences. And finally, my best suggestion is read Bessel van der Kolk. The book is The Body Keeps the Score. It's arguably one of the best books ever written about trauma recovery, and there's a million great suggestions in there. And I'd be happy to talk about this further on other live streams. Okay, one more question. Great question and scenario posed by a mom who is struggling to parent children who have survived trauma. Thank you for writing in. I think the first piece of acceptance is that parenting children who have survived traumatic experiences is a very long-term proposition. I'm biased. I've raised 2 children of my own. I think parenting is the hardest job in the world, and parenting children who have survived abuse and neglect is exponentially harder. Trauma interrupts child development. In addiction recovery, we have the term of arrested development. We know that the age at which a child starts using substances to cope is the age at which typically they stop maturing emotionally. So a child who starts drinking or drugging at 12, 13, 14, oftentimes their maturity ceases at that point because they're using substances to deal with life and feelings. A very similar thing is caused by trauma. Trauma interferes with the child's development, going through developmental stages, all the way from birth into early adulthood. And it maybe even a little bit more insidious because it's not something that we observed or knew was coming. The biggest guidance that I have for parents who have children who are survivors is notice the ways in which you interpret your children's behavior. Kids who survive trauma are often oppositional and defiant. A child who's behaving in an oppositional or defiant manner is a child who feels unsafe. It's a child who is carrying past pain and anger and has not yet developed the cognitive ability to understand abstract concepts or competing truths. And so the kiddo quite often can't articulate what they're experiencing or feeling. If we need to be careful in interpreting children's behavior or how they present themselves as feeling, because if we are only looking at the here and now, sometimes the child's behavior or emotion feels unwarranted or even wildly disproportionate to what's happening in the here and now. And this is, again, the impact of past trauma manifesting presently. So we need to learn to think in a way that is a little bit counterintuitive. It's not just about what's happening in the here and now. It's the possibility that the child has been triggered. It's the possibility that they are getting in touch with some emotion that was repressed long ago. So we can't get hung up on behavior, nor can we get hung up on the idea that your child's behavior is disrespectful. It may very well be, but we need to focus on what are this child's unmet needs, what's going to help them to feel more safe in the present, what is it that's going to help them regulate their emotions and their behavior in this moment. Notice too, the opposite of the child who's oppositional and defiant is the child who tries way too hard to please others, the child who endlessly strives or tries to be perfect. Please stop referring to children as old souls. That drives me crazy when I hear that. When you see a child whose maturity transcends their chronological age, there is a reason for that, and there's a very good chance that that reason is painful. Get involved in the stuff that your kids care about. Listen to the music they listen to. Watch the shows. Check out the artwork that they think is cool. Whatever it is, there's a good chance that it's going to reveal something to you about what it is that they're feeling, what it is that they're going through. And if nothing else, it might make you a slightly cooler parent. Play with your kids. Oh my God, play with your kids, play with your kids, play with your kids. This is so fucking important. I know it's hard, if you've got angsty 13-year-olds, teenagers, kids that don't really want to spend time with you because they would prefer the company of their friends, or they feel like they need a ton of time alone. I get it, that's okay, but any time that your kids will allow you to be present, be present. We need to stop thinking about children as having behaviors that are quote-unquote attention-seeking. Children should not have to seek attention. It should be something that is readily available to them. Children are meant to be adored. Tell your kids often the things that you see that are good about them. Give them appreciation, compliments, love. Be authentic and genuine in saying these things. And then make sure that your behavior matches up to what it is that you're saying. The example that I usually use is I routinely heard from my parents that they were proud, but their behavior didn't really support that idea, so their being proud of me was like something that I knew but didn't really know how to feel. Be vulnerable with your children. Be silly. Be awkward. Do the things that you would never do out in the real world. Growing up with my kids, I actually sang, and I have the most god-awful singing voice in the world. But my favorite thing about children is that they are unlikely to judge, they are just in the present moment, and they are having fun. But kiddos who have survived traumatic experiences are not in the here and now. They are struggling, and they are looking to feel safe. And by definition, they are always doing the best that they can. There's so much that they're up against. By all means, please get your kids into treatment. Do not drop them off at the therapist's office. Go in with them. Talk with their providers about how you can best support them, how you can best promote their healing and growth. People who treat children, particularly children who are survivors of trauma, are fucking saints. They are amazing people, but they also have a very high rate of burnout. And it's never because of the kids. It's because of parents who are actually part of the problem. And in your case, I know that you love your kiddos. I know that you're a good mom. And I know that you want to do what's best for them. And what's counterintuitive about that is that one of the very best things you can do for your children is take excellent care of yourself. So notice when you're parenting out of guilt. Children need structure. They need consistency and limits. A child who has clear boundaries and consistent rules feels safer. The child won't like the rules. And particularly if your children are children of alcoholics or children of addicts, we're kids that learned how to manipulate. And we know how to guilt trip you. We know how to try to get at what it is that we want. But if you give us that power, which the child always believes that they want or even need, the child is not equipped to handle that. So catch yourself parenting out of guilt, catch yourself doing anything out of guilt, and then remind yourself that there's two forms of guilt, rational and irrational. Rational guilt is your conscience telling you that you did something wrong, and that's great, go correct it. But irrational guilt is very common for us. It's, I haven't done anything wrong, but I feel as though I have. So today's live stream is a little bit longer than normal. I have to wind this up. I thank you for your questions, and if I didn't get to your question today, I promise I will next time. I'm going to be rejoining you soon. Please take excellent care of yourselves. Please make use of our now completely free resource, which is sobernow.com. 2 28-day home study programs, complete anonymity, complete confidentiality, and absolutely free. Available online at sobernow.com. Thank you for joining me today. If you're watching the live stream long after the fact, please give it a quick like. Drop me any comments or questions, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.